Hi, I'm Anna Soper. I'm a visual artist, writer, and librarian in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. Welcome to Teen People, the podcast inspired by my collection of Teen People magazines. Teen People was published between 1998 and 2006. Like their parent publication, People, Teen People featured A-list celebrities and human interest stories alike. In the year 2000, Teen People's then publisher Anne Zarin said presciently, "We make celebrities real, and real teens celebrities." In other words, Teen People saw their real teen contributors as influencers. They printed their full names, ages, and locations, which makes many of them pretty Googleable today. I founded this podcast in 2020 with the goal of tracking down real teens from my Teen People collection and finding out how life was going for them as adults now in their 30s and 40s. Over the past year or so, I've been leaning into my day job as a librarian by interviewing authors who write about the late 90s and early 2000s. In this episode, I'll speak with Colette Shade, whose book Y2K, How the 2000s Became Everything, Essays on the Future That Never Was published by Day Street Books on January 7th, 2025. Join us as we stroll down memory lane. My favorite book about the internet is by the Canadian author Douglas Coupland. In his 2014 book, Kitten Clone, Inside Alcatel-Lucent, Coupland asks, where did the sense of invention go? The sense of futurity? The sense that by working in tech you were somehow building a better tomorrow, a smarter tomorrow, a more democratic tomorrow? Colette Shade begins her book, Y2K, in that period in which it was generally felt that by working in tech, you were somehow building a better tomorrow, a smarter tomorrow, and a more democratic tomorrow. Plus ça change. In Y2K, Colette writes, the early 2000s were marked by a sense of both unbridled optimism and existential dread. It was a new millennium, and the future had no limits. Technology was fun. For many, it felt like the end of history. We solved all the big problems. No more wars, no more racism, no more sexism. But then history kept happening. What was the Y2K era, and why are we still living in its shadow? Y2K's essays on subjects as varied as blobby furniture and see-through consumer electronics, Vogue magazine and disordered eating, and McMansions, Hummers, and Starbucks explore this question. I spoke with Colette in mid-December 2024 and began by asking her what inspired Y2K.
I really want to write a book. I've wanted to write a book since I was a kid. What in the world should I write about? And my agent was like, well, what do you like? What I told him was I liked the year 1998 because it was the best year of my life. Well, that 1999, which I talk about in the book. He said, well, maybe there's something to that. We talked it out. And then eventually, after a few back and forth meetings, we came up with this idea together of a book about the 2000s.
And for those who haven't read the book, why is 1998 to 1999? Why was that the best year of your life?
Well, I mean, in 1999, I got $100,000.
That helps.
I mean, it was the best year in my life because, so one thing I kind of want to back up and say, the way I conceived of the book was as this enmeshment of the personal and the historical, because we all live in history, whether we're aware of it or not. Like when I was 10, 11, I wasn't running around thinking, oh, I'm living in this historical era and here are the important economic forces and political events that are shaping my day-to-day life. But now with some education and hindsight and a lot of research, I can actually see how things that I took as normal were actually part of a historical moment. So the reason why 1998 and 1999 were so great for me, there's a macro and a micro, right? So the micro is I was a kid, and of course not everyone has a happy childhood. I had a pretty happy childhood. I wouldn't say, it wasn't perfect, but like I would just ride my bike all over the neighborhood. I would watch my shows. I would collect Pokémon cards. And it just, it wasn't even just the 90s. And I get at this in the book a bit. It really was just being a kid and not having to worry about the things adults have to worry about, like taxes, career, bills, things like that.
Yeah.
The future. Kids usually aren't thinking that much about the future.
Mm-hmm.
And so things were good for me because I was a kid, but things were also good because of some bigger things that were happening in the economy. There was this thing called the dot-com bubble that started in 1995. And I write about this in the book because it ended up really shaping the course of my life, as well as my perspective on a lot of different things. The dot-com bubble started when there was this big IPO, which is the first time a company offers public stocks, for a computer company or for a browser company, a tech company, let's just say a tech company called Netscape. And what that showed the market was that, hey, the internet, which, by the way, started in 1991. So it was brand new. It was a 4-year-old technology, and people thought it was a fad. People thought it was just a fun toy. There was no understanding that this was a place where you could make a lot of money yet. And what the Netscape IPO did was it showed the market that, hey, you could get really rich here. And so it became this speculative boom that propelled the rest of the economy and the stock market way, way, way up. And so there was this general notion among the general public, regardless of whether or not they were involved with the stock market or with the tech world, that the economy was going to keep improving forever. We had finally figured out how to get prosperity for everybody. Yes, there had been increasing inequality in the 80s, and frankly, it was actually continuing into the 90s, but it was masked by this bubble. And so it was overall an extremely optimistic time, just in very broad brushstrokes. So in my own life, my uncle was involved in the tech world. And, he was like a regular upper middle class guy for most of my life. And then he lucked into a company that he had invested some money in, that he had helped to run, was bought up by Nokia, which at the time was a huge, huge company. And it basically took him from being a regular upper middle class guy to a guy who bought an 8-bedroom second home and was talking about getting a private jet. There's like this unimaginable wealth that I certainly hadn't grown up around. It shaped at the time this belief I had that, and which actually I found in my research, that actually this is a belief that a lot of Americans had. It wasn't just, and this was global. It wasn't just America. You saw this too in Britain with New Labour. You saw this in Canada as well. You saw this all across the world, this idea that, well, the economy was just going to keep going up and up forever. There actually was a guy he was an economist for MIT, and I have his quote in the book. And he said, what did he say? He said, we will never have another, he said something to the effect of, we will never have another recession again. The economy will keep expanding forever. That's how people thought. Mm. And so you have this broader climate. You have me as a kid, and I'm just doing kid stuff, and I'm content in the way that I think a lot of kids are content, or at least the way that adults think they were content as kids. And then you have this bigger story that's happening where there's this broad optimism that is being transmitted through the media that I'm hearing, kind of overhearing without fully understanding from adults in my life. And then this closer to home and more specific story where a member of my family suddenly stumbled into all this money and gave my brother and I $100,000 each of Nokia stock at a time when it was a blue chip stock. This allowed us to go to college debt free. So I'm very grateful, because a lot of people, because the stock market was going up so like at such a steep rate that people were making crazy profits. If they just invested in a random index fund or any random stock, almost, they were making unheard of profits.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the challenges of writing nonfiction is that you have to stop, but history doesn't stop. The news doesn't stop. And I can imagine that it's frustrating for an author to write a book and then have to stop when it's time to publish. But my experience of reading this book right now was that it's incredibly timely. And even so much of the past 6 weeks are in this book if you read between the lines.
Yeah.
Tell me how it feels to be publishing this book right now.
Well, I really agree with you that it's timely. And I think that I'm glad that I picked a history book, because I think that it's really hard to write a book about current events because current events are constantly changing. And so usually when you read a book that was written about something in the past 5 years or an ongoing developing story, it immediately feels dated by the time of publication day, because, like you say, stuff keeps happening. And publishing a book, I mean, to even go from the shortest possible time frame for a book from contract to publication is 2.5 or 3 years. And that's a long time, and a lot can happen. And so I think for me, choosing to do a history book was helpful. So that was part of it. But I also think that I think if we really want to understand a lot of the things that are happening right now with the political crises, the ecological crises, the economic and financial, I don't want to call them crises, but craziness, let's just say, that is happening right now. I think if we want to understand these things, it behooves us to understand what got us here. And this book was very much written as a sort of, how the heck did we get here?
Mm-hmm. I think there's a few different chapters in the book that really feel prescient and timely for this moment. So you do write about sex ed in middle school and the purity culture that emerged in the US in the period in the Y2K era. And it's interesting to see that the same discourse is happening now online in trad culture.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah, so that was an interesting chapter to write, and that actually was one of the hardest. And by the way, I keep saying chapter, but I want to be clear that this is a book of essays. They're interconnected essays, and so they do all stand on their own. But I deliberately arranged them so that they would sort of tell an arc both of the time and of my own life. I mean, there is a bit of bouncing back and forth, because what I do with each of the essays is I pick a pop cultural moment, whether that's, or a pop cultural object, right? So in one of them, it's an inflatable chair. In another one, it's a ludicrous video. In another one, it's a trip that we always took to San Francisco to see my uncle. Right. So I pick a moment from either pop culture or from my own life, or really like my own encounterings of pop culture, or something in my own life that was a microcosm of a bigger event or moment. But yes, that essay was really challenging to write, because so I'm coming from what I think is a sort of minority background for a lot of Americans in terms of how sex was talked about, not only in my family, but in my bigger community. And I am coming at my upbringing critically, but I don't want to. So, okay. So I guess I should give some background. So I come from both my parents are atheists. I'm, half, basically I'm half, if you want to get genealogical about it, I'm half Lutheran, half Jewish, but I was raised an atheist. And my parents my mom anyway, started taking me to what's called a Unitarian Universalist church when I was a kid, which is a church. Well, it's called a church, but it's really not a church because it doesn't have any holy books. It doesn't have any prayers. It doesn't have any beliefs. Well, it has beliefs, but the beliefs are like, be nice to people, accept everyone. Then when I was 13, I was sent to this class, which is sponsored by the Unitarians. So it's at a church, which isn't really a church, which is really like a club for sort of atheist liberals to hang out and feel good about themselves. They're nice. They're all very nice people, but whatever, I have my kind of critiques of it. It was this class that was a comprehensive sex ed class. And I felt I knew I had to write about this, but I really struggled because I have a lot of critiques of the class, but I didn't want my critiques to sound like the people who are trying to ban books from libraries or stop drag shows or all of this stuff, right? And I just it took a lot of work and thinking through and showing this essay to different friends whose perspectives I respect, who have different insights from various viewpoints, whether, feminist or religious or political or whatever. And so basically, I felt like a pariah because I wasn't getting the purity culture stuff that was normalized in America at the time. And I also kind of resented that as well, in addition to having my own kind of theological critiques and kind of cultural, gentle critiques of the institution. So yeah, I really, really struggled to write that essay. But what I basically settled upon was this. I think that, the culture war shows no signs of abating, and it drives me up the wall when the culture war is talked about. And I think that essay helped me figure out why. So what the culture war really is a proxy war. The Christian right in America, really what allowed it to take off, in my opinion, is the fact that in the 1970s, you started having major economic changes for the worse. You had stagflation, which was inflation plus stagnant wages. You had a gas crisis. And then you had the very beginning of what we now call deindustrialization, which is where manufacturing was getting shut down in America and the jobs shipped overseas. And whole communities were being really pushed into poverty or pushed down lower than they had been. Women were entering the workplace, which was great, in my opinion. But one reason, but also, and that challenged a lot of cultural understandings of family. Yes. And gender roles, but also one reason women were entering the workplace was because of these stagnating wages and the industrialization. And so you have these major changes that are, aside from the women in the workplace and integration, I would say bad, right? Like, I don't think it's good for wages to stagnate or for people to lose their jobs. And so you have like this, and, even if you're not affected by this directly, there's this general sense of malaise in the country. And so I think the reason the Christian right got so much traction, because before it had kind of been a somewhat marginal group, I think it got traction because people were struggling, or they felt that they might struggle sometime in the future, and they were looking for something to give them an enemy. And the Christian right has a great enemy. It's gays. It's all those slutty women. It's it's abortion. It's all of these things. And what I say in the essay is that sex I think, feels really easy for people to control because it's something that we all have sexual feelings of some kind or another. We all have bodies and we see people, wearing more revealing clothes or whatever, right? Like,
Yeah, you write about all the music videos of the late
yes,
90s and early 2000s that you
right.
grew up watching.
Yeah. Yeah. But like, so you have this one side in this proxy war who they're really mad about these economic changes and worsening of their lives, but then they're like, it's the feminists and the gays' fault. Everyone, stop having sex before marriage, and women get back in the kitchen. And then, you have people like my parents who are secular liberals who are like, what? That's ridiculous. You people are idiot yokels. And I think what I figured out, the thing that made me feel off about it was it felt like we were kind of pawns in this proxy war where you had this side that was like super homophobic and just anti-woman, anti-sex. And then you have this other side that's like, and to be clear, that other side is also under duress from the economy. And so they're like, hey, capitalism and the economy, that's a pretty far, or even technology, right? These are far away forces. These are not things that you can touch and see, but sex, that's something I feel like I can control, right? And so they sort of strike back by saying, let's do this super sex positive stuff. And then you have the other side saying, oh, look at these freaks that are grooming children, right? Which you hear now all the time. And I realized that the point of the essay was not to put forth a verdict on whether the specific class that I had was good or bad or representative of all comprehensive sex ed or sex positivity or any of this. What I realized my actual point was that I was trapped in a proxy war. And the culture, and not just then, all the culture war stuff is a proxy war. The people who want to ban books, that feels accessible to them, whereas gaining control of their economic conditions does not.
Yes. Two words in all of that, malaise and control, really stand out for me. And I think that's what's led us to, it's what led the United States to the first Donald Trump presidency. It's what led you to the second Donald Trump presidency. And as I was reading this essay on sex ed, I was thinking about this manifestation of control. The men posting "your body, my choice" on social media. You're rolling your eyes for the listeners. And I thought of that when I read this essay because it not only makes sense to them, but it gives them a feeling of control.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would also argue that it would be easier to teach kids whatever the good way is to teach them safe, mutually respectful sexual behavior in the conditions where people have a basic sense of respect in other areas of their lives, because this is kind of a lashing out of an area that people feel like they can control, whereas they don't feel they can control like how much money they're making or their healthcare or anything like that. And so I actually don't think it's a coincidence that like you guys have universal health care. You guys have like better, I think you guys have like, what is it called? You can only be fired with cause and like you don't have at-will employment. And so you have like, marginally better conditions that people are living in. And so this is a concern. And there's the right is growing all around the world, even in countries like Canada, countries like Sweden, countries that have, much better safety nets than the US and much better infrastructure. I think that the reason that the US seems to have such craziness, like kind of seems to be on the bleeding edge of the crazy anti-sex, far right, far religious right stuff, is because there's a lot of resentment in daily life that Americans, they're just so used to. They don't know any better.
Speaking of Canada, something else that makes the book really timely, in the final essay, you describe the housing bubble, the mortgage lending crisis, and you describe that as the end of the Y2K era. And you link this back through American history, describing this process of colonization that is part of Canada's creation too. And so you write, by the end of the 19th century, America looked out at the Pacific Ocean. There was no more land to take. So we looked abroad to the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Guam. We looked to Haiti and Hawaii and all of the Americas. Later, we looked to Vietnam. And then by the time I was a teenager, to Iraq. So I found this really interesting timing reading this as a Canadian when your next president is saying that maybe if Canadians don't like the prospect of a 25% tariff on all the things we import from the US, that we should become the 51st state. And I am taking that seriously.
Don't say that?
Yes. Did you not hear about this? Oh my God. So apparently he made this remark on social media and also in a meeting with Justin Trudeau and some federal government ministers at Mar-a-Lago after his election.
Okay.
And I'm actually taking this seriously. When that man speaks, that is a window into his mind. Like, he thinks out loud, and we all know that he fixates on things. And this is his latest fixation. And I think as Canadians, we should take this seriously, and we need to shut this conversation down.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
No. I think also that chapter ties in really nicely with the climate change essay, because you write about Hummers. And to me, I think of McMansions and Hummers in the same breath.
Oh, yes. Yes. I think they very much are. And by the way, I don't think it's a coincidence that I think a lot of non-Americans and or Americans who have an academic history background most resonated with that last chapter and with the climate change chapter as well, because both deal with legacies that are hundreds and hundreds of years old and situate things that happened within the Y2K era within, the 200 some years that America was a country, or really even before, because it actually, the history I talk about starts in the 1600s. The climate change essay, it's all about the Enlightenment and the different paths that the different and conflicting paths that the Enlightenment has led us down. And I mean, look, I'm an American, so I guess I'm allowed to say this, but I do think that Americans don't always have the stomach to think about things that are kind of historical or require them to have a certain level of criticism. Not all, but I think that there's certainly a tendency among the reading public, whereas I think in general, people from other countries are a little bit more willing to look at history and to look at things, I think, through a more critical or less happy lens.
Why do you think that is?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I wonder if it could even be answered by some of the stuff that I talk about in that final essay. So I read this book in 2018 or 2019 by the historian Greg Grandin. He's a historian at Yale, and it's called The End of the Myth. And it is a history of the American frontier from the pre-revolutionary era to Trump. And he ties together all of this stuff that I previously thought was totally separate, just like everything from, okay, so first of all, he debunks one of the biggest American myths ever, which is the myth that the revolution started because of the Stamp Act and because of tea taxes. And now I know that this is hotly debated within the community of academic historians, and I'm not an academic historian, but I did find Grandin's argument. Grandin is an academic historian, and I found his argument convincing, which was that the actual most likely cause of the revolution, the American Revolution, was the fact that the British Crown told American settlers that they were not permitted to just take exactly whatever they wanted from indigenous people, right? Like said that there were limits. There was a revolt essentially. And what Grandin argues that the revolution represented was a mandate for endless expansion, which means endless displacement of native people who are already living there, taking their land, but not just that, but that the fact that this happened and that America is so big allowed for all kinds of other weird stuff about America that I never understood. So, for example, like we were talking earlier about the fact that, well, it is interesting actually, because Canada also, as you mentioned, is a settler colonial country, Australia as well. And so I was going to say, well, that this explains why America doesn't have like single payer healthcare or universal healthcare. I think it gets a little more complicated than that. And I'm not here to get into that. But essentially, to keep things very simple, Grandin argues that in Europe, in continental Europe and in the UK, there was not endless land. And so when you had industrial capitalism developing in the 19th century, you had all these people who were forced into factories and they were like, yo, this sucks. Like, I don't want to work 14 hours a day and like lose my arm and make no money and live in a tenement. And so they ended up, there are all of these revolutions and various unrests and violence. And then eventually out of that came these labor parties that advocated for people to like get higher wages and vacation and healthcare and all of this stuff. And America never had that because America had endless land. So when Grandin argues, when industrialization came to America, if you were white and you were like, I don't want to work in a factory, that sucks, you could just get out of there, right? Like you're living in New York, you're like, I don't want to live here anymore. I want to go out in the prairie.
Which also kind of sucked, but in a different way.
In a different way, because yeah, it sucked. And you were part of this settler project. But what Grandin argues is that the fact that we had this frontier allowed us to avoid having like any kind of social democracy. And then when we hit the frontier in the 1890s, when we got to the Pacific, there was this total crisis. And we ended up getting involved in what's now called the Spanish-American War. And Grandin argues that that was a product of crisis because we needed to expand. And so we are now expanding outside of the continental United States to the Philippines and Cuba and all these other places and Guam. And like, that's why we have Guam, I believe. Yeah. That might be wrong.
I've never understood that, to be quite honest.
Yeah. Essentially, it's like, have you ever played that game? I think it's called Katamari Damacy, where it's the snowball and it's rolling downhill and it's like taking different stuff and there's like cows going into it and houses. You know what I'm talking about?
I don't, but I can picture this.
Yeah. So it's I don't know, it's a game from like, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. And I just feel like America's land holdings are like that, where we're just like, okay, Louisiana Purchase, more than tripling the size of America. Okay. Guam for some reason, Puerto Rico, sure. And we're just like picking stuff up and Hawaii and Alaska, like
Guantanamo Bay. I never understood that as a teenager in the early 2000s. I was like, but it's in a different country. How does that work? How can they do that?
Spanish-American War. But yeah, so, and I had never understood this, and not to get into every detail about Grandin's book, but his book really totally shifted the paradigm. And I had read that book just before I started to get the ideas for Y2K. So it ended up deeply shaping how I thought about the Y2K era. And because I felt like the Y2K. So basically, throughout that book, he basically argues that every time the frontier is closed in some way, or there's some crisis of the frontier, there's more crisis at home. What oftentimes it comes out as like racial crises, racism at home, and then, oh, we have all of these contradictions. Now we need to do a war again to make everyone get along.
And that's actually why I don't believe that Donald Trump is a president who will de-escalate war, because if any president goes around saying America first, that means that there will be conflict somewhere. If not domestically, there will be conflict outside of America's borders, because you can't say that and not assert America first.
Of course. And also, to get back to real estate, what is Donald Trump? A real estate developer.
Yes. Yes.
Which again, I think that this, to kind of get back, I think I maybe went a little too long on the Grandin book just because it was so influential from me. And I'm really flattered because he blurred my book.
Ooh.
I was so proud, but like,
that's thrilling.
Yeah. But to kind of bring it back to the Y2K era to explain why this is relevant. So there are a couple of frontiers during the Y2K era that I viewed through this Grandin frontier closing and crisis lens. So one is the frontier of cyberspace. If you do research into early, like back as early as like the 60s and 70s, when the internet was DARPA, like a proto-internet, people were talking about like the cyber frontier. People were calling themselves cyber cowboys. And so people who were using the early internet actually saw themselves as settlers. And they saw this as a place where they could be free. Because this is the thing about a frontier, is that a frontier does allow you freedom, right? Like the reason that people went out to the frontier to live in like Iowa and Oregon was not just because they were racist or like wanted to steal. It was because their lives would have sucked and they wanted to be free. They wanted to they didn't want to have a boss telling them what to do every day. They wanted to like work for themselves. And the internet and its early in the 90s through basically the platform era in the mid to late 2000s, where everything started to really get consolidated, it was like this open frontier. And there's this sense that this would give us freedom. Then frontiers are also often a way to make new wealth. And so there's this idea of, okay, gotta get in here, get into this gold rush. And then you also have this frontier of the housing market, which ties deeply into this kind of, America has a long history of property ownership as being like the pinnacle of basically being a citizen and being free. For decades, politicians have talked about the American dream as owning a house, right? You're not living the American dream unless you own your own house. And I saw in this chapter to kind of draw this continuous line from this American dream of getting out from like living in a crappy condition and working at a factory and getting out to the frontier of America to like the dream of owning a house, but then it's kind of twisted because you're not really owning a house if you're using a subprime mortgage, and then that explodes, and then that totally like destroys the economy. And the reason that I choose to end with that is because I think that 2008, it was a real break in American history, or at least in the American history that I had lived through, because what the Y2K era was characterized by was this belief that everything would expand forever and that the line would always go up, and that also that we could settle things without politics, right? Like, and I've actually heard there's a really good interview by Vincent Cunningham, who has a novel that's like a fictionalized novel about the Obama campaign, basically. And he gave a really good interview on the podcast, Know Your Enemy. And he said that part of what happened after 2008 was that there was a resentment among millennials like me or like him because we now had to do politics, right? We couldn't just, we actually had to say, hey, what can we do about these problems? They can't just be solved through the line going up forever.
I think getting back to that idea of ending the book on a frontier is really, really interesting. And I'm thinking especially of the internet as a frontier, as you say, that's evident in the aesthetics of the Y2K era. Thinking back to the sort of the clip art of our childhoods, a boy in jeans and a t-shirt on a skateboard on the information superhighway, circling around the world. It gets into, I think, even this new frontier of possibly colonizing Mars, which I think is
absolutely
folly and ridiculous.
I would agree.
So I love that. Was it Olivia Rodrigo who says that's her litmus test for when she dates a guy? I think it was Olivia Rodrigo. She will ask on the first date, what are your thoughts on Elon Musk and colonizing Mars? And if the guy says, I'm all for it, she's gone.
Good for her. That's a really good one. I mean, I'm married now, but like, yeah, I wish I'd had that in my back pocket. Sure.
In the introduction, you write about your disappointment that the future you imagined as a child was so derailed by the events of the Y2K era. And I have to say, I really identified with that too, because I can also look at my life and especially the last 20 years and think this isn't quite what I pictured. Yeah. So you write, try as I might to shape my life in a particular way, it has never been mine to shape. Much of adulthood has felt to me like an accumulation of disappointment and despair. It's historical, it's personal, and I'm not quite sure where the one ends and the other begins. And it hurts because, as Smash Mouth says, the years start coming and they don't stop coming. So I wanted to ask you the question that I ask all of my guests. I think it's especially pertinent for you because you've written a book about your childhood and your young adult self. What advice would you give your teenage self today if you could?
Oh gosh, that's a tough one. I mean, oh gosh, I should have come prepared. I don't know. I mean, okay. I suppose, and this doesn't really touch on, I don't know if this touches on anything I don't think this touches on any of the stuff we've talked about.
That's fine.
But, one of the essays is about dealing with an eating disorder and kind of getting sucked into that being my life for a couple of years and how it really was pretty terrible. And I feel like I wasted a couple of years on this bullshit. And I wish that I could go back and tell myself, like, fuck that. Like, you don't have to make yourself almost pass out to be of value. Like, you don't have to, you don't have to live like this. And, but I also think part of that is telling myself that is kind of debunking a lot of these stories that I believed about, how the world worked, because I think a lot of the conclusions that I came to when I was a teenager were based on a faulty understanding of how the world worked and this feeling that I just always had to be hustling or that I was always being judged. And, I actually think that there's truth to that. This isn't, these are rational conclusions in the society that we live in and that we lived in at the time. But I guess I wish I could have told myself that I had value that was beyond that.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Teen People. You can help me out by sharing my work on social media or posting a rating or review of this episode. Find me on Twitter and sometimes Instagram at TeenPeoplePod. Check out the show notes for information on how to buy Y2K, and have a look at Colette's stunning Y2K-themed website, which is very nostalgic and is also linked in the notes. I consider this episode a companion of sorts to 2 other episodes that I've done. So if you liked this episode, you might also like my conversation with the Canadian author Lisa Whittington Hill about her book, Girls Interrupted: How Pop Culture is Failing Women. I've also interviewed the British columnist Sarah Ditum on her book, Toxic: Women, Fame, and the Tabloid 2000s. You can find both interviews by scrolling back through my past episodes. I'm Anna Soper. See you next time.